From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus with Paul Salem.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. This week we're going to be talking about the further implications of U.S.-Iran policy. Early in May, President Trump withdrew from the nuclear deal with Iran. And this Monday, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo issued what might be called the 12 Commandments to Iran about what is required for the U.S. to strike a deal, as he put it, make a treaty with Iran if they comply with a long list of demands, a kind of all-or-nothing offer. With me to discuss aspects of U.S.-Iran policy and what Iran might be reacting and what it might be doing, as well as a slightly deeper dive on the Iranian energy and oil sector. With me are two of my colleagues and friends, Mr. Rauf Mammadov, who is a resident scholar at the Middle East Institute, and Rauf focuses on energy issues in Central Asia and the Middle East, the wider Middle East in general. Rauf, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting.
And also with me is my good friend Ahmad Majidyar. Ahmad runs MEI's Iran Observed project, follows Iran closely, U.S.-Iran policy closely, and writes daily over these issues. Ahmad, thanks for being with us.
Glad to be with you.
Let me start with you, Ahmad. Recap the highlights of the 12 Commandments. How would you explain them to our audience?
Well, Secretary Pompeo laid out a policy of containment for Iran. He said that the Trump administration will step up sanctions on Iran in order to force the regime in Tehran to accept a new, more comprehensive nuclear deal that would address not only Iran's nuclear issue, but would also address Iran's destabilizing role in the region and also ballistic missile issue. And as you said, he also made 12 requirements for the New Deal, which would include a permanent ban on enrichment, would also include a very more robust inspection regime so that international inspectors can go to Iranian military sites, something that Iranians have said that that's a red line. Also to release all dual national Iranians, including Americans who have been imprisoned on spurious charges inside Iran, and also in support for militant and terrorist groups in the region. And also, most importantly, that Iran should halt its production and proliferation of ballistic missile activities.
A long list of requirements. Let me ask you, you described it as containment, but here's a question. I mean, it might be one of four things. One, it could be a strategy for negotiation, right? I mean, Trump claims he's a good negotiator. And Secretary Pompeo did put it in a way in the context of an eventual deal. I mean, he said, you do these things, we will offer all the good things and support and economics, and we'll send a treaty to the Senate and we'll become good friends. So one approach would be sort of similar to the approach with North Korea, that what the Trump administration maybe, at the end of the day, maybe wants a deal. A second way to look at it is maybe like somebody like John Bolton might look at it as a list of impossible demands in order to squeeze Iran in the interest of fomenting regime change. So that would be a second. A third one is containment, as you said. But here my question is, it is a strategy that maybe would be designed to weaken and impoverish Iran. Would it also contain it, since it's already in Iraq, it's already in Syria, it's already in Lebanon, it's already in Yemen, and the strategy doesn't also contain a rollback aspect, which would have to be done in Syria, in Iraq. And so among all those options, what do you think the administration is doing?
Well, although Secretary Pompeo was very clear about the requirements that the United States has for a New Deal, there was not a clarity in terms of how the administration would achieve these very ambitious goals that it has set out. And secondly, also that what the end game is. And as you rightly mentioned, if we see, for example, with North Korea, that President Trump took a very maximalist approach, or also even, for example, in trade negotiations with China, similarly. But after that the negotiations started, he showed some flexibility. So whether these 12 commandments, as you put it, are the strict requirements or whether these are starting point for negotiations, these are uncertain.
We don't know yet.
Yeah, this is
Very
absolutely
interesting.
uncertain. But the main problem in this speech that I noticed was that Secretary Pompeo or nobody in the administration has actually laid it out that how the Trump administration, just through sanctions, can force the Iranian regime to come to the negotiating table. Because first of all, these requirements, definitely Iran will reject them. Many of these requirements, they are red lines for them. And also, there is not an international coalition or consensus to force the Iranian regime to come to the negotiating table. And secondly, the European allies, although they share all these 12 concerns that Secretary Pompeo mentioned in his speech, but they differ with the Trump administration on how
Certainly.
to achieve them.
Yeah. Rauf, let me turn to you. I mean, the sanctions will hit, obviously, many sectors. The key sector for Iran, obviously, is the energy sector. And it was hoping that its production would continue to increase, that the new investment would obviously expand its capacity. Now maybe it's going in the other direction. Give our listeners a sense of where does the Iranian oil and gas sector stand today? Where was it hoping to get to? And where is it now likely to go with the sanctions?
Well, yes, Iran's economy is still heavily reliant on oil and gas revenues. And just to depict Iran's oil and gas production at the moment, it's very important to put in comparison with the pre-sanction period. When the sanctions were applied late 2011, early 2012, when it became enforced, Iran in 2012, January, was producing around 3.9 million barrels a day and exporting around 2.8 million barrels a day. Mm-hmm. Iran reached that levels last month, April. Again, yes. In 2018. Just to put in the context, it took them almost 2 years to get to those levels. And the way they reached that level was not due to investments in oil and gas production per se, in the development, in exploration and development. They reached those levels, first of all, with the release of volumes that were floating in the tankers.
Past production.
Yes, which they couldn't export due to sanctions, when European companies, even some Asian companies and countries were reluctant due to reduction requirements by Obama administration. And secondly, by improving their efficiency of their refineries. So more efficient these refineries function, that means less crude oil they have to consume to produce these products. That means more crude they have to export it abroad. Combination of those two factors finally contributed to reaching that level in last month. Having said that, before the sanctions, before the backout of the United States from JCPOA, Energy Minister of Iran made a statement just a couple months before that, saying that they are planning to increase their production 700,000 barrels per day by 2020, which is not a substantial figure. But in terms of, if you look at the historic perspective, it's a big number. Mm-hmm. And given the current abundance in the market, it will add substantial amounts by 2020. Since these new sanctions were applied, were announced, Iranians have been trying to do two things. First of all, they have been trying to maintain the deal. And secondly, trying to persuade European and Asian buyers, which is the two big markets for Iranian oil, not to follow the sanctions and to keep the import rates that they've been.
How can they do that, do you think?
The pattern is that for instance, the national Iranian oil companies top officials traveled Asia. They met with the Sinopec, the Chinese major oil company, which is one of the major refineries owned by Sinopec, is the major buyer of Iranian oil. So it goes through bilateral, face-to-face persuasion. And also,
but then, what do they persuade them to do? In order to avoid sanctions, buy in another currency. How do they channel it?
Well, I think it will be a more ad hoc negotiation. Mm-hmm. I don't think they have any umbrella. Their strategy is to approach these countries one by one. Mm-hmm. In Chinese situation, it could be trading in yuan, which China has been actually promoting by, recently they have established a stock market in Hong Kong for trading in yuan. So that will contribute to their efforts.
And with
to do that.
India or South
With
Korea?
India, even during the relief of the sanctions, some of the trade were happening in rupee.
Mhm.
It's still unclear on how will India react because of India's geopolitical stance. India's is a democracy. It's an ally of United States.
So it might have
It might have some
considerations.
reservations in regard. South Korea, interestingly, already reduced their imports from China before the sanction.
From Iran.
From Iran before the sanctions. So they are relying more on other sources. It might be a precautionary approach by Korean government or Korean companies anticipating or expecting such, because
Thank you.
the talks
Yeah.
were going on since October 2017.
Ahmad, comment on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly add that one of the guarantees that Tehran has asked the European Union in order to remain in the deal has been that European powers should continue to import Iranian oil, because the European Union is the largest importer of Iranian oil. And one of the issues that Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif has talked with some European leaders is that they would replicate some of the deals that they had in the past with India or Russia or even China to do these transactions in local currency. And Europeans are exploring ways of perhaps creating a separate financial system that can pay for Iranian oil to the Iranian central bank despite the sanctions, and
That's
do those
interesting.
trades in euro rather than dollars.
That's interesting, because that's a European activity that is government related. I mean, it's European. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. European governments would be the ones, or government agencies, purchasing oil and for energy and electricity and so on. Or is it not? Is
Not
it
necessarily.
private companies?
What EU can do, and there is a precedent when sanctions were applied to Cuba, they might issue a blocking waiver for European companies, actually oblige them not to follow the sanctions. But unfortunately for Iran, we already see the developments are going towards the way where European companies are already making announcements showing that they are reluctant, or they need more concrete American waivers. For instance, Total's announcement said we want US waivers with discussion, with consultations with Europeans. That's very important.
Yeah.
Not
Not blocking waivers.
Not blocking. So they actually want the US waivers
But my
to be
question
enforced.
on the purchase of oil, let's say or gas, I don't know, but mainly oil, that that does not going. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's not Total that's purchasing, or a private company. It's
No, it is the private companies, refineries purchasing.
they're purchasing
yes.
it, so it's the same
But
problem.
the only solution that they're looking for, besides trading in euro, is having those waivers from you.
Okay.
But since Total left, the Maersk, which is the Danish company, the largest shipping company, they said they're pulling out. The German Alliance insurance company and many other companies have already made
announced
clear.
already. Yeah.
Yeah, another avenue that also the Europeans are exploring is that if they can, because Total and others, they have very large market share here in the United States, and they do not want to put those at risk just for a much smaller market in Iran. But they want to incentivize some of the smaller European companies that do not do any substantial business here in the US through, for example, providing credit lines to them and also other facilitation, so that they would be more willing to invest in Iran and also do business with Iran.
Ahmad, let me ask a different question. I mean, you follow the Iranian press very closely, and I mean, obviously there's been much outcry from Iran and even from Europe about the decision to withdraw and so on. Fine, but the decision is taken, and here we are in the U.S. For the next, the duration at least of the term of this president, is on this trajectory of sanctions and all of that, and maybe longer than that, because it's going to be hard for any president to undo it politically. Anyway. If one is an Iranian citizen, one was hopeful about the deal. One is maybe upset that maybe Trump withdrew. But the reality for them is now they're facing years and years, certainly, of economic, challenges, hardships, and so on. How would you describe that perspective And how are people reacting? And, what does the future look like in that sense?
The Iranian people appear to be very nervous about the prospect of Iran's relations worsening with the rest of the world after the sanctions. Because although, as you mentioned, that majority of the Iranians voted President Rouhani so that he can open Iran to the outside world and can lift the international sanctions. But although the JCPOA resulted in the lifting of most of the sanctions in January 2016, but the Iranian people did not benefit much from that because much of the growth in Iran has been in the oil sector and did not trickle down to the average Iranians. And that's why we saw these massive anti-government protests in December and also early January. However, now they're expecting even harsher times, although they're not happy with the result of the JCPOA. But they now believe that these new sanctions would make their life even more difficult. But having said that, it's also important to highlight that Iran's economic problems is not just only because of the international sanctions. Corruption, mismanagement, and also particularly by elites is another key factor. And the Iranian people know about it.
Well, how does this put President Rouhani? I mean, he banked a lot on the deal. Okay, the returns were not as high as expected, but there were some. And now much of the deal, or a big, the key component of it has evaporated. Where does it leave his presidency, his second term? What can he promise people beyond sort of what Churchill said, like blood, sweat, and tears, going to be tough? And where does it leave his bid to be the next supreme leader, or really to lead the Iranians? Has it really crippled him as a political leader?
Not yet, but it has the potential to do so because as sanctions are coming back and it will have tremendous impact on the Iranian economy, that certainly affects Rouhani's presidential legacy and also could determine his future political ambitions, because right now there is a very fierce political factional fighting inside Iran over the succession of supreme leader. On the one hand, President Rouhani wants to create a large base amongst his constituents and also with different political groups, including some moderate conservatives, in order to become the next supreme leader. At the same time, the Revolutionary Guards and the hardliners are trying to exploit this situation, saying that we were right about the JCPOA. We said that let's not trust the United States.
Yeah.
Yes. So now they feel vindicated about that, and they would try to use this to weaken Rouhani even more. So these external sanctions would not only impact Iran's economy, but would also intensify this factional fighting, which has been happening for quite a while.
Interesting. Rauf, let me turn to another angle on the energy issue, which is towards Russia and Central Asia. I mean, we talked a little bit about China and India. Russia obviously is an oil exporter, but Russia has good relations with Iran, would want to help Iran out, I imagine. Could it do so on the energy field, and if so, how?
Well, since the relief of sanctions, even before the first sanctions, Russian companies were involved there. But since the new contract format was announced by Iran, there were 18 contracts signed since the relief of the sanctions. Some of them are investment contracts, some of them just a memorandum of understandings. But what's interesting is that 14 of them were signed with Russian companies.
Wow. 14 of 18.
14 of 18, and just one European company. Of those 14 contracts in oil and gas development, just one was signed for particular development of an oil field by Zarubezhnev, which is Russia's company. One of not the major oil company, but the mid-level oil companies. The thing is that Russian companies are also having hard time with finding cash for their projects, and they are also under sanctions. Most of these companies are under sanctions. Russia is facing Western sanctions. The economic situation in Russia has been stabilized, but it's still, as in Iran's situation, is dependent on oil and gas revenues. So it will be tough for Russian companies to make those to be committed. Yes, they're both under sanctions. These are, but geopolitically, it brings Russia and Iran together. Although two states have always had reservations since that deal between Russia and United States back in 90s not to invest from Iran. So since that time, Iran had reservations with Russia. And historically, these two empires have had their issues. But I think the backup from the sanctions will only bring Iran's and Russia's positions together.
Interesting.
And also, it will help them to disentangle other issues, problematic issues, which they contradict each other, and to concentrate on constructive stuff.
Well, in the same vein, let me ask you about energy relations between Iran and Turkey. Turkey obviously is a hub. How are they going to be affected by the sanctions, and will Iran and Turkey look for workarounds?
Well, Turkey is yet to become a hub. It's just a transit country.
I should have said that. Yeah.
But Turkey, as you said, is very important for Iran in terms of access to Europe. And currently, there's a gas supplies to Turkey around 5 billion cubic meters. Azerbaijan will actually pass Iran in the supplies with the commissioning of the second pipeline, the second gas pipeline called Trans-Anatolian Pipeline. But Iran will still be a substantial supplier of gas to Turkey. And Turkey was also involved in, even during the sanctions time, Turkey was involved in helping Iran. We have seen cases where, they paid with gold and to avoid the sanctions. So there is relations between Turkey and Iran, but I think it's also overwhelmed with other issues, especially in Syrian issue, and also Russia's interests with Iran, not in every aspect actually, complement each other. There are some reservations in that field as well. So I think it will be subject to multi-vector negotiation process, will be a result of that negotiation process where these two countries can come up with solution. But the Iran's idea of resistant economy, I think they also want to export that. And since the more and more countries are being subject to US sanction policies, and I think that's becoming an axis of economic resistance actually in that region.
Well, actually, if I briefly can comment on that, because this resistance economy is something that the Revolutionary Guards and the hardliners have been emphasizing on for quite some time. The philosophy behind the resistance economy is that we have to focus on our homegrown capacities to be able to stand up to any external pressure. So now that the sanctions are coming back, the Revolutionary Guards inside Iran would try to pressure the Rouhani government to give them more contracts inside the country. So that could lead to more militarization of the Iranian society and economy.
But as you said,
well.
The resistance economy, which has maybe been going on in a sense for 40 years, much of the Iranian public wants to move forward, wants jobs, and they've been protesting for that. So now they're in for another period of difficulty and challenge and some isolation from the world. It won't be airtight. So it's going to be interesting to watch also how
it's even more dangerous for the regime than previous protests, because it's not happening in urban areas. It's happening in more conservative and rural areas, which historically have been the base for the regime. Yeah.
Well, that's all the time we have. So I want to thank you, Rauf Mammadov, for being with us today and enlightening us on the energy issue. Thanks, Rauf, for being with us. And thank you, Ahmad, for being with us. Ahmad Majidyar, who runs our Iran Observe project.
My pleasure.
Thank you for being with us. And thank you, our listeners, for tuning in. And we will see you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.